Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our fifth Brics conference of the University of São Paulo. And my name is Emílio Mendonça Dias da Silva. I am a researcher of the Center for Brics Studies, and I'm happy to serve as the moderator of this panel. As we know, in this edition of our traditional event, we are discussing BRICS cooperation in the readjustment of global relations. It means that we are exploring some issues that will be important for not only restoring the conditions, but the social conditions, but also to improve it. And now we are having a panel of a very important matter, that is the condition and the protection of minorities in BRICS countries. And for this purpose, we have high quality panelists who I would like to introduce to you now. So we will be happy to hear Professor Jonas Magedi. He's a PhD candidate in public administration at Tsinghua University of Technology. He's also a master for the same institution, and he has a large experience in strategic advice. After, we will be happy to hear the lecture of Professor Felipe Alamino. Professor Felipe Alamino is a doctor of international law by the Faculty of Law of University of São Paulo. He's also a researcher of the Center for the Studies of International Protection of Minorities. Then we will be delighted to hear the perspective of Professor Valdir da Silva Bezerra. He's a master in international relations by the St. Petersburg State University. He's also a researcher of the Center for BRICS Studies. And in the last speech, we will be happy to hear Professor Cassio. He's a doctor in international law by the Faculty of Law of University of São Paulo. He is a researcher of the Center for BRICS Studies and also a researcher for the Center for Studies of International Protection of Minorities. Before moving to our discussion, I would like to remind you that the presence shall be registered in the form available in the chat. It's also true about the question. In our descriptions, we have a form in which you can place your questions. On behalf of the Center for BRICS Studies, we would also like to say that we are extremely delighted, honored with the audience. We are happy to announce that we are having students come from all BRICS countries, and this is really important for us because we designed an event to be the most pluralistic possible. So we are really very happy to receive the audience, and all the panelists comes from all the countries of BRICS. And now moving to our discussion, please let's start with the perspective of Professor Jonas. Professor, it's a pleasure for us to receive you. Please have the floor.
Thank you so much, Cassio. And I just have to indicate that the title professor in South Africa is one that an individual has to really work so hard before he is given that title. So just to ensure that I don't get arrested in my country, let me just put it on record that I am addressed as Mr. until I achieve or reach the level required to be called a professor. But I appreciate the confidence. It does motivate me that I must work towards that. Moving forward, let me also appreciate the opportunity I've been given and greet the panelists, colleagues from different countries who will be, whom I will be sharing a platform with tonight, and also greet the viewers from all over the world. including those who will catch up this some other day, because I know that it is recorded and will be accessed on YouTube whenever viewers wish to follow the conversation. I wish to start with 2 points. The first point is an apology because I'm going to be using an impossible English. And this is because of the conditions I've been exposed to throughout the period of learning or process of learning in a country that has been historically colonized by Britain. And subsequently, Afrikaans as a language also imposed on us, and therefore our indigenous languages suffered a great deal, but also we struggled to even adapt on learning some of the languages that were imposed on us. And therefore I'm really struggling with this English language. So I must apologize up front. I am going to be presenting, and I just wish to share my screen, of which the second point following the apology is, just an indication that indeed I appreciate and will try by all means to, to avoid overlapping, because I'm not alone in the platform. Is my screen, I am sure I have now shared my screen. I'm going to be presenting on a topic called Language, Mother Tongue Education and Identity in Post-Apartheid South Africa. And I think I've already been introduced. This presentation will point to the fact that although the previously oppressed majority in South Africa rose and gained their freedom following years of white minority rule, linguistic emancipation seemed to be the hardest battle to win or even wage. The presentation also looks at language from a class perspective and locates English as language of power, education, and trade. This also owes to the colonial history of South Africa and what I call linguistic imperialism. And now, just to point something to that, I have therefore reduced this presentation to basically about 4 points. And on the first one is I will just give a bit of a background on the history of South Africa and the white minority rule, which really influenced the language policy in the country. Then we will look at the dominant language being English and how it continues to remain dominant even today in the country and many parts of the world. And this being due to really the global political powers and commercial engagements that are taking place globally. In educational context, questions of identity are especially critical because of the development of educational practice and policies are grounded in different ways of understanding who learners are and or should be. Educational achievement has been equated with proficiency in the English language. And this point will emphasize more so demonstrating how so many countries in Africa and arguably in the Brics countries have been, dealing or having a challenge with the English language that has a hold over knowledge production and has become a central language in education against the marginalization of the indigenous languages in the countries. And what lessons can we draw from Brics countries or member states regarding linguistic rights of minorities? The concept of minorities applies not only to those groups who are numerically in an inferior position. Sometimes a minority group can also be defined as a group that is in numbers larger than the rest of the population, but who have a particular lack of power. And this is the case in South Africa in relation to the question of language, because in terms of demographics and population, the Black African people are over 80%. The Zulu people or citizens of the country, Zulu-speaking people, are over 25% in the country, surpassing English and Afrikaans, but their rights and language is not even at the level of any of the two dominant languages, being English and Afrikaans in South Africa. The poorest communities in the world, I mean, in the world, yes, of course, in almost any region, tend to be minority communities that have been targets of long-standing discrimination, exclusion, and sometimes violence. Sorry, I just want to be sure that because I'm sharing my screen, but I've made it small. I must register another apology that I am not that advanced with technology. I guess it must be better. The poorest communities in almost any region tend to be minority communities that have been targets of long-standing discrimination, exclusion, and sometimes violence, and therefore requiring special protection measures. However, special protection measures are not always reserved for the numerically small groups, as in some countries, the small groups may prove to be the most powerful, yet groups with the least access to power are found to be the largest group in the country. And just as I have already indicated that with our colonial and apartheid history in South Africa, the majority, what is regarded rather as the majority in the country, is actually the most marginalized and dispossessed country. I mean, citizens or groupings who economically, socially, and culturally are disempowered. And this, I emphasize on it much on the question of language and education in particular, because the minority groups in South Africa, or those that are perceived to be the minority groups in South Africa, in terms of race, are generally the dominant in terms of political power and knowledge production in the country. For reasons connected with the colonial history of South Africa, the language of power in the post-apartheid South Africa is English, followed by Afrikaans, and which I will point to the fact that it is diminishing with time. And this is because in the late 1960s and 70s, Afrikaans has been growing, or was growing faster, and proving to be equalizing with English in South Africa. But post 1994, Afrikaans has been really diminishing in number of public schools, primary, secondary, including institutions of higher learning. A brief history of English and Afrikaans dominance in South Africa. By the end of 19th century, the Afrikaans literary output was still limited, and its status as a public language was also very low. The Anglo-Boer War between 1899 and 1902 was the major turning point in the rise of Afrikaans. The choice as the symbol of reconciliation fell on granting equal status as official languages to English and Dutch, which was later to be succeeded or replaced by Afrikaans in 1925. And this is because Afrikaans really is, as a matter of fact, an indigenous language of South Africa, but that came to develop and take shape, in 1800s, and particularly also in early 1900. All along, Afrikaans was regarded to be what is called kitchen language, because this has been a language that was in general created and used by slaves that came from Malaysia, which came into contact with Dutch-speaking people, and out of it really a hybrid of a language came forth, but this language proved over a period of time to develop and become an academic language that in South Africa today is one of the most spoken languages in the country. In the 19th century and the first half of 20th century, English held the high ground, but by 1960s and 1970s, steadily Afrikaans had almost reached parity in societal equality with English, and I've made this point. The new South African state had little financial capacity to establish universities and could only transform the South African College to University of Cape Town with serious support from private donors. Mining magnates from who were the main sponsors of UCT were highly opposed to Dutch or Africans and wanted UCT to attract highly quality English-speaking academics from foreign shores. And so basically and this is as early as 1918 in South Africa, when UCT came to be established on University of Cape Town, as a consequence of the Anglo-Boer War, the unity between the English and the Afrikaans was not really that cemented unity. The contest for the control of the public institutions, business, and society at large was still a very serious and systematic battle between the two groups. And this came to be demonstrated when the emergence of universities in South Africa was beginning to take shape. Mining magnates that funded the establishment of UCT wanted to see to it that English is the dominant language in UCT or at UCT. But of course, Afrikaans came to be taught there as well. But this led to some of the well-established business people in South Africa, amongst them, Jannie Marais, a Stellenbosch farmer and a mining magnate, who was also a major shareholder or a shareholder of De Beers mine, a mine that was engaged in a business of diamonds, donated funds to funding Stellenbosch on condition that at least half the lectures were given in Dutch or Afrikaans. This is part of the history that gave effect to the establishment of Stellenbosch. Amongst those that led to the establishment of UCT is, before his death, Cecil John Rhodes. He had written a will donating land and 500,000 pounds to South African College to establish an independent university, which later became University of Cape Town. And 500,000 pounds, as far as 1918 or 18, would have been to the modern day almost 500 million rands in South Africa. And Jannie Marais had donated or left a will as well when he died in 1915, a will donating over 100,000 pounds for the founding of Stellenbosch University on the very condition that I had already mentioned. And just to go back to Cecil Rhodes, you would see there with the statue that that has been removed, that on the picture that his statue was removed just not long following what we call a fallist movement in South Africa, and I'll point to it. A protest that was led by university students fighting for decolonization of education. And amongst key demands that were put forward by the students was the removal of these colonial symbols that would have carried with them a memory of marginalization, exploitation, and violation of basic human rights of African people, and that their statue ought to be removed on the basis that they do not symbolize anything that they knew South Africa would have been symbolizing or would be standing for. Under apartheid, the two languages of the white minority, and namely Afrikaans and English, held sway over and above the indigenous African languages. While English retained the preeminence it had historically acquired in the public domain through service as the language of British colonial power, Afrikaans was systematically developed with enormous state resources and blessing into a second official language or a second official language. In the history of South Africa, the National Party took power, or the main Afrikaner political organization took power in South Africa in 1948. And from when they led the government of South Africa, they made sure that state resources are directed further to the development of the Afrikaans language. And indeed, the language developed to a point of equalization with English in the late 1970s, as pointed. African languages have throughout these periods remained societally inferior and relatively insignificant. African languages are used almost exclusively in the domestic and informal domains in the social lives of African language speakers. None of these languages has ever been developed as a medium of instruction in educational institutions beyond the third year of school. And this is the contending point, or the point of contention, that even when South Africa gained independence and democratic elections held in 1994, to this day, African languages have not really been developed, or have not been developed to be academic languages or even economic languages, because they are not languages that you can use in industry. To the very best that an African child in South Africa can learn his mother or her mother tongue, it is up to grade 3 in some schools. Beyond that, with the core subjects that are developed, such as economics, agriculture, anything else that you wish to teach children, there is no African language that has really been developed, indigenous African language. And of course, with the exception of Afrikaans, as I've already pointed out, that rightfully so, it is an indigenous language of South Africa. But the rest of the languages of the native people of South Africa, none of their languages have really been developed to any. The post-apartheid years have seen the limited but principled dismantling of the administrative structure of apartheid-based education and the adoption of the new education system, which reflects better, at least on paper, the cultural and linguistic interests of African language speakers. Constitutionally, as well as in terms of the nation building project, it is more than obvious that no language can be treated as though it is intrinsically superior or inferior to any other. So post 1994, about 11 languages in South Africa were recognized to be official languages in South Africa, and none was regarded to be superior to any. And that is insofar as the Constitution is written. But beyond that, realities in terms of the language question in South Africa still resemble the very apartheid and colonial design, both in our education systems and in the economic design of our country. There's an attempt to move away from the apartheid policy of dominance of both public and the formal private sector by English and private sector dominance by English and Afrikaans. But it would be a mistake to think that the movement will lead to the enhancement, equalization, and intellectualization of the indigenous African languages when the world of work and business is English in South Africa. And to this point, quite often a question arises in South Africa, even towards the Black people, that given an opportunity to take your child to school, where your child will only learn isiZulu or Pedi up to university, would you take your child to that school? The fundamental question here is, language cannot be seen as just a medium of instruction in universities or schools, but detached from the economic mode of production in society. Because indigenous people, or rather African people, even if such an opportunity arises, if there is no reconstruction and redesign of the economy, no one will indeed direct his or her own child to a university where he will only learn how to be unemployed. As a matter of fact, this is the reason why English would have been perceived to be a language of, or a determining factor on whether a person is intelligent or not, which is not really a material fact. But when a person goes to interviews, when a person goes to work, the language that is used in a place of work is indeed an English language in many spaces of our country and also globally. And this is where the question of whether or not the indigenous languages can be able to be developed quicker, that there is a relationship between the development of our indigenous languages and the design of our economy. The only kids who have mother tongue education from primary school to the university are first language English speaking children and very many first language Afrikaans speaking children. Those who were advantaged during apartheid are still advantaged in the post-apartheid South Africa. And this question is backed up by a very clear evidence that a substantial amount of Black kids in South Africa, even up to grade 4, cannot read for comprehension or for understanding. A research has already been conducted, but it is not only that. Even the teachers in most of our schools who are given the responsibility to teach these primary school kids have failed number of tests to prove their competency in English. And this demonstrates the fact that kids come from homes where they are not speaking English, they are not speaking Afrikaans, but transit into schools where a medium of instruction is a language that at home is a foreign language. And only English speaking kids and African speaking kids have a greater opportunity to go to primary school, secondary school, and up to university, learning the very language that is their language at home. So to an African child, there are two worlds that exist. It is a world at home where you are with your parents, you interact with your parents, speaking a language different from what a university, from what a secondary school or a primary school would interact with you in. And that is why the indigenous languages in South Africa will always be perceived to be languages that our kids and anybody else who comes from the African communities or Black communities would despise, because why else would you learn a language that is not going to assist you in school? You'd rather spend more time reading books that are written in languages that will help advance your cognitive ability when you are in the classroom. And that is the very fundamental question that has led to the disadvantage of these languages. We speak about learner-centered education in South Africa, yet we teach learners in the language they don't understand. If our education is learner-centered, then language of the child should be the point of departure. English is not even the language of the teacher in most schools. Provincial governments and universities should enable multilingual education. And this point I make because schools in South Africa are regarded to be exercising a sense of autonomy in terms of our constitution. So the school governing bodies could, upon consultation with communities, put what we call introduce languages that the indigenous, the native people could be able to use. But the matric exams or the grade 12 exams can only be written with the approval of the provincial governments on what question papers should be used and the medium of instruction, languages of medium of instruction rather, that could be adopted. And universities also, if they do not have any form of education that is led through these indigenous languages, then learning these indigenous languages will prove to be a waste of time. According to the Progress in International Reading Literacy study, 8 out of every 10 children in South Africa can't read properly, not in English, not in their home language, not in any language. Semi-linguistic or linguistism affects the development of cognitive skills and later educational development. This is because kids have got to struggle at a young age with 2 languages that they are not sure. You are home, you are taught to greet people this way. When you are school, you are taught to greet people this way, and it delays your cognitive ability because you feel you are wrong. Mommy is wrong or the teacher is wrong at the same time. In South Africa, as I have already pointed, teachers have failed competency tests. The government had said that they will reassess the teachers. That by 2017 was not done, and that is a story for another day. Namibia also had classified a language policy as poisoning children after it had proven that over 98% of their teachers, and also arguably in Southern Africa, were not sufficiently proficient in the English language. Can the South African education system move away from English, mainly sometimes English-only language policy? This can only happen if we can demonstrate that if we can demonstrate the economic value of African languages. And I have made this point that there should be that relationship between the economy and language policy in the country. It is important to accept that language policy, class, and power are tightly interwoven. Section 29, subsection 3, and section 36 of the Constitution does approve that minorities can open their own schools, but how else would you open your own schools if you do not have the financial means to do so, but if your schools also cannot speak to industry needs and design? Minorities and language in Brics countries, and briefly, in Russia, the law about language of the people, about the language of the people of the Federal Republic of Russia protects the right of minorities regarding language. Article 9, subsection 2 on rights on language says that everyone has the right to receive basic general education in one's native language and the right to choose the language of instruction. Not only does the Russian law only end there, but it also criminalized the use of propaganda to undermine languages or rights of minorities. In India, Article 29 of the Constitution of India protects rights of the minorities. Subsection 2 states that no citizen shall be denied access to public institutions on grounds of language. The government of India has ministry dedicated to enhance the rights of minorities with focus on education. In China, the compulsory education law, Mandarin, recognizes Mandarin as the national common speech, minority language as the first language in minority regions. The Constitution stipulates equality of all nationalities and protection of minority rights with greater emphasis on national unity. Article 53, regional autonomy law for minority nationalities, does give autonomy to government to encourage all ethnic groups to respect each other's languages. The Constitution of Brazil, on the other hand, in its Article 215, protects indigenous and Afro-Brazilian cultures. Article 5, subsection 42 states that racism is a crime where bail is not an option and the person is liable for imprisonment. Very fundamental is the Brazilian language policy recognized by law 10 subsection 436 of 2002, that Brazil deaf people, sign language users have to have egalitarian access to all the social sectors. The law determines the inclusion of Libras discipline as mandatory in teacher training and speech therapy courses and as optional in other higher education courses and professional education. I'm just trying to be fast because I'm realizing I'm out of time. Key developments in South Africa, and the point that the slide that talks to the what you call protection of minorities and language in Brics countries, in conclusion, will point to it. Key developments in South Africa today, between 2015 and 2016, a protest movement in universities called the Fallist movement came to shape the public discourse and rather confronted the government, leading to the shift from Afrikaans and English equal status as medium of instruction in South African universities. 4 universities in South Africa that still had Afrikaans as a medium of instruction: University of Pretoria, UNISA, University of Stellenbosch, and University of Free State, had to review their language policies. But not only that, that had prompted the government to review the 2002 language policy for higher education to replace it or introduce what we call language policy framework for public higher education in 2020. And this was because while we had the language policy that would have protected the rights the rights of the minorities, racism was seen to still be rearing its head in many classrooms, where quite often people were told that those who want to go to Afrikaans this side and those who want to continue with English this side. And you would notice that those who would go to Afrikaans classes in their majority would be white students. And it was as though this is now a reintroduction and deepening of racism in the country. The new language policy framework seeks to address the challenge of the underdevelopment and underutilization of official African languages. The key challenge that has to be addressed in South Africa today is the increasing hegemony of English, functional multilingualism and economic efficiency and production should also be looked at when we deal with the language question. Just a demographic picture of languages spoken within households in South Africa. The population of South Africa is pointed to over 81% are Black Africans on the second picture, and 9% are colored, which in their majority in South Africa arguably speak Afrikaans, and 8% are white, which is both Afrikaans speaking and English, and 3% is India, Asian, and so forth. The dominant language, as indicated, is isiZulu at 25.3%, followed by isiXhosa and Afrikaans, then Sepedi. In conclusion, we have to be exceptionally careful not to fall into the trap of prescribing cures that turn out to be worse than the sickness itself. And this, as in the slides above, in the recent past in South Africa, including just this month, there's been constitutional court rulings around Afrikaans being a medium of instruction in universities. And the recent ruling is on the University of South Africa versus AfriForum, where the Constitutional Court held that the university has not really demonstrated grounds on why such a language should be replaced or be removed as a medium of instruction or official language in the university. And this follows other rulings that would have, of course, in University of Free State and Stellenbosch, did approve that Afrikaans can be replaced. Now, I want to point to the fact that the whole conversation in South Africa, I argue that should not be about replacement or removal of languages that have already been developed, but should be an argument about the development, advancement of the marginalized languages, be isiZulu and others that I have pointed to. South Africa has got official 11 languages. But to the example of Brazil, not only that, but also the sign language, that the number of people in South Africa who could benefit from the use of sign language, deaf people, but also those that can actually be teachers of the sign language. We could be able to learn from the Brazil question by ensuring that we develop some of these languages and ensure that they are the languages of, they are becoming academic languages and languages of commerce. Intelligentsia must accept that policy, language policy, class, and power are interwoven. And I've pointed to that point. Socio-economic costs of language development are far important than monetary costs. And this is because quite often an argument about language is always about who will carry the cost if you introduce another language. But the disaster and the catastrophe that follows marginalization of indigenous African languages prove to the fact that many learners are not able to progress in school, some of whom are becoming dropouts, some of whom begin to question their intellectual and cognitive capacity as a consequence of the socio-economic conditions in the country. The challenge of indigenous languages being reduced to informal communication and marginalized economic activities is a serious challenge in South Africa. All BRICS member states have different languages, culture, and religions. This creates a challenge of fully protecting languages of minority groups, particularly in formal education. But a correct example can be drawn from Russia, for instance, where there is a support for minority languages. It may not be a perfect picture, but of course, the fact that it is even illegal to use propaganda to undermine minority rights, the example of Russia, of Brazil that I've pointed to, the example of China around the autonomy in the regions, in ensuring that indigenous languages in those specific regions are given a sense of support, even though Mandarin may be the common language, but minority languages are given support to ensure that they are becoming academic languages in the regions with state support. BRICS should, and of course the example of India as well, where BRICS states or member states can be able to draw a lesson of introducing a ministry of minorities that specifically deal with the question of language amongst many other issues. BRICS should learn from other member states and strengthen their protection and enhancement of language, of languages of minorities. And I think that I have tried to speak as fast as possible, jumping many other points, but to this point, I've got to appreciate and apologize. I thought my slides were very short. I am realizing that we're beyond what I had planned. Sincere apologies and much appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. You see, I've learned Mr. Jonas. It was very interesting, the presentation. It shows us how awareness on how language is important, how minorities are important in having access to education. I would say also that perhaps we would reach a conclusion talking about Brazil, that legal provision also depends on public policies to give effect to that provision, because here we have structural problems also. So concerns on access to education here are not so simple, but I believe that everybody is delighted with your presentation, because it was really very interesting, reminding the audience that you can send your questions in our forums. And now let's move to the speech of Professor Felipe Alamino. Professor, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Emílio, and good evening, everyone. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today in the 5th Universidade de São Paulo's Brics conference. Initially, well, I would like to thank you, Emílio, the Instituto Iberachina, and the entire organization for the kind invitation to me to come here to say a few words about minorities in Brazil today, as well as I would like to greet my fellow panelists and our audience. I have prepared a short introduction about the state of art, so to speak, of minorities in Brazil. Although there may be some dispute about the definition of minorities, I would like to paraphrase Francesco Capotorti's report in light of the scope of the Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from 1966. In this report, Capotortis states that minorities are understood in international law as non-dominant groups numerically inferior to the rest of the population of a state, whose members possess ethnic, religious, and/or linguistic characteristics that differ from the rest of the population, and shows a sense of solidarity towards preserving their culture, traditions, religion, and/or language. Well, this has evolved, and for instance, during the 80s, Professor Emma Cora, an Austrian scholar, argued that the non-dominant position is more important than numerical inferiority. Nevertheless, as there is no binding document which defines minorities, the term minority in international law remains as with a loose definition and up to doctrine interpretation. It can also be considered that, in some sense, the term minority was drawn to explain Europe's reality. It was stated, for example, that in Brazil, there is no such a thing as minorities. Instead of it, only the very nation of Brazilians dwells the country. Nevertheless, that's quite not true. Albeit, the indigenous peoples have internationally recognized different status, we can reckon in some sense that they have similar characteristics to what could be labeled as a minority, although different. Despite the internal self-determination granted to indigenous peoples, they also differ from the rest of the society, presenting ethnic, linguistic, and religious own characteristics and the will to preserve it. Violation of indigenous peoples' rights, although aggravating during the current president's term, is unfortunately not new. That can be said that since the so-called discovery of Brazil, Portugal's conquest of the land, the indigenous peoples are under threat. Land demarcation is a big issue nowadays in Brazil. Well, it's always a big issue in Brazil, but nowadays is on spotlight. Even though there are indigenous lands in Brazil with the size of countries as Belgium, such as the case of Xingu land in Mato Grosso state, which is Central-West region in Brazil, they face pressure on the borders from agriculture and the mining industry, and especially Xingu from drought and wildfire. Another threat is related to new land demarcations caused by the interpretation of the marco temporal, time frame of the Brazilian Constitution. The time frame is under scrutiny of Brazil's Constitutional Court, and it may give light to the discussion if the indigenous lands in the country are to be recognized by the time of the proclamation of the Constitution, 1988, or can be recognized after it. As Brazil has had a dictatorship from 1964 to 1985, many indigenous peoples faced forcible transfer from their traditional lands, only returning to it, if so, after 1988. Therefore, the marco temporal, the time frame, would prevent them to regain the ownership of their lands, which raises great concern. Another important topic is the linguistic rights in Brazil. Brazil's last census, and well, it's 11 years ago, unfortunately, showed that there were 305 ethnicities, different ethnicities, indigenous ethnicities, and up to 274 different languages in the country. The most of them are under threat of disappearance. Census states that less than half of the indigenous population still speaks their own languages. While, just to remark, in Brazil, the only official language granted by the Constitution is Portuguese. And if we compare with our neighbor countries, it's quite different from our neighbors. Countries such as Paraguay, Bolivia, or Ecuador have granted official status to their native languages, alongside with Castilian, Spanish. For instance, Bolivia's constitution alone grants, alongside with Spanish, more than 30 indigenous languages, the official status. So we have, if it is 30 languages, I think it's 36 indigenous languages. So in Bolivia alone, there are 37 official languages with Spanish. Nevertheless, timid efforts were made in order to hamper these cultural laws in Brazil. In the municipal sphere, some native languages were granted official status in the last years, such as the cases of São Gabriel da Cachoeira in the Amazonas state, with Niangatu, Tucano, and Baniwa languages, Tocantinha in Tocantins state, with Acue Xerente, or even Bonfim in Roraima, with Macuxi and Wapixana. All of these states are in the northern region of Brazil. With this recognition, the idea is that children could study in schools in their mother tongue, and local administration documents shall be issued in Portuguese as well as in the indigenous languages. Moreover, in the federal sphere, there is some recognition by the Ministry of Culture and IFAN. IFAN would translate as National Historical and Artistic Heritage Institute, about the cultural importance of 7 languages that constructed Brazilian society. 6 of these 7 languages are indigenous. They are Assurini, Guarani Imbiá, Naukuá, Machipu, Cuicuru, and Calapalo. The 7th language is Italian, a language from the Veneto region in Italy, spoken in southern Brazil, states such as Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul. With this recognition made in the federal sphere, I reckon that there are some tools to upkeep Brazil's idiom's diversity, however, not as sound as it should be to ensure the survival of all the 274 languages listed down in 2010. Alongside with indigenous peoples in Brazil, there are groups called traditional peoples and communities, which are recognized by the Presidential Decree 6040 from 2007. These groups are culturally different from the rest of the population of the country, having its own social organization, occupying the territory and exploring natural resources as a means to keep its traditional cultural, social, religious, ancestral, and economic way of life. The research group, which I'm a member, and Cassio Zen also, a fellow researcher, CEPIM, Center of Studies on the International Protection of Minorities, is currently researching if there are traces that could be considered in order to sustain that those groups, in total or in part, are Brazilian minorities. As there is a plethora of groups ranging from economic characteristics to language and religion, there can be said that not all of those groups can be called minorities in the traditional sense. This sense is Capotorti's definition, so to speak. But the ones such as povos de terreiro or Pomeranians, which is a German people native to Pomeranian region, Pomen in Germany or Pomorze in Poland, present the characteristics searched, such as religion or language. The same presidential decree guaranteed the promotion of the necessary means for the effective participation of traditional peoples and communities in instance of social control and in decision-making processes related to their rights and interests. Articulation and integration with the national food and nutrition security system, the contribution to the formation of collective awareness on the part of public bodies on the importance of human, economic, social, cultural, environmental rights, and social control to guarantee the rights of traditional peoples and communities. The eradication of all forms of discrimination, including the fight against religious intolerance, which, if you are Brazilian, you may have already read that this is quite an issue in Brazil nowadays, and the preservation of cultural rights, the exercise of community practices, cultural memory, and racial and ethnic identity. In addition to that presidential decree, another one from 2016 stipulates a list of these traditional peoples and communities. This list includes different groups such as indigenous peoples as well, Rom people, which were formerly called as gypsies, but the name is Rom people, Quilombolas, which were former enslaved people in Brazil, which regained liberty, fighting their masters, and other groups. However, all the work is still to be done. It is very incipient. It only exists on paper. Many of these populations, such as the Quilombolas, for instance, constantly suffer pressure made by landowners due to state prices and the risk of losing their ancestral territory. And if I may add, also due to racism. The current state of our research, I mean, in our group, allows us to say that the initial premise that there are no minorities in Brazil is at least mistaken or misunderstood. They do exist. Even if they carry another nomenclature, they do exist. And just like minorities elsewhere, they are under pressure from the dominant society, especially with regard to cultural massification. I believe that this is the most important part that I have to bring to you today. And well, I shall thank you again for the invitation. I want to be pleased to answer all of your questions, if you have any. Thank you very much.
Impressive, Felipe. I believe that now the reality in Brazil is clear. It's complex. And for sure, most parts of cases, when you have a discourse of unity, it just means that you are oppressing more. So, yeah, I believe that your speech was very important for all our Brics fellows to understand a bit of our reality. And now let's move to Professor Valdir. Please have the floor.
Well, first of all, I would like to say good night to everyone who is following the 5th Brics journey organized by the Faculty of Law of the University of São Paulo. Also, I would like to say thank you to all the panelists that came before me and who are present in this event today. Also to the moderator, Emílio. Allow me to share a screen. I would also like to show some slides. So my presentation will be mostly related to minorities in Russia. Oh. Okay, one moment. My presentation will be dedicated to minorities in Russia. More specifically, I will present a brief overview on the Muslims issue in the Russian Federation. Very briefly about myself, I lived in Russia from the years 2017 to 2020 due to a master's degree that I finished in the University of St. Petersburg. I am also vice coordinator of the National Network of Researchers on Russia of Brazil. This group of researchers is called Rederu. I'm a researcher at the Brics, the group of studies dedicated to Brics from the University of São Paulo, and also from NUPRI, which is another research group from the University of São Paulo, in this case dedicated to the study of Asia. So I would like to start before I come into the aspects concerning the Muslim minority in Russia, because I will be mostly speaking about a religious minority in Russia, to present you with some data about the post-Soviet context. So I took this graph from an institute of research based in Moscow called Levada Analytical Center. This is an independent analytical surveyor, and they question a number of Russians from since before the fall of the Soviet Union until the year 2015, and they were trying to analyze their religious affiliation of the Russian population. So what we can see in this graph is that the Russian population went from less than 20% in terms of affiliation to the faith, the Russian Orthodox faith, to about 70% in a matter of 25 years. So what we can say, looking to this graph, is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the ideology of communism lost its grasp on the state and on the population, there was a religious revitalization in the Russian society. And the Muslim population, more specifically, would be placed in that strata that you can see in the graph above, that has the title of other. So the Muslims in Russia, they are belonging to this strata. Moreover, we can see that during the presidency of Vladimir Putin, there was a close approximation between the political power, which is represented by Putin himself, and the ecclesiastical power, the religious power, which is represented by the Russian Orthodox Church. Once Vladimir Putin is shown many times in the Russian television being present in the Orthodox services, and also giving speeches to church representatives and also other religious authorities that belong to the Russian Orthodox Church. But we should remember that Russia is a complex country, and it has many confessions of faith, and also hundreds, and I'm not saying this to exaggerate, but hundreds of nationalities. Of course, some of them are in the number of thousands, but nevertheless, they are all present in this extensive territory of the Russian Federation. So I highlighted in this slide the two main sources of the Russian Muslim minority population, and those sources come. If we look to let's look to the right first. They come from some specific regions inside Russia. Those regions are located mainly in the south, and they are composed by Chechnya, Dagestan, Cherkess, and also from a region that is relatively close to Moscow, so to speak. And this region is the historical Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. In fact, those regions, they also, as mentioned by Jonas, there are some local languages in this region. The national language, the unifying language in Russia is Russian, but they also speak in the local languages in those places, and they are mostly Muslim populations that live there. And the second main source of the Muslim minority population in Russia comes exactly from the Central Asian states that we can see a graph like the borderlines of the Central Asian states in the picture to the left. These people, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after its disintegration, due to the lack, in this case, of economic perspectives in those countries, most of the youth of the Central Asian states, most of their population, they migrate to Russia to seek for better educational and better economic perspectives. And the majority of those populations from these states that end up migrating to Russia are Muslim. Well, in this case of there are two main aspects that I will touch upon when it comes to the minority populations of Russia, and mainly the presence of this population in Russia for the state has some political aspects that should be taken care of, that I will discuss, and also some sociological aspects that are related to the Russian society, not specifically to the Russian state, but the Russian society. So in the beginning of the 2000s, some extremists present in the region of Chechnya, that are the region of Chechnya and Dagestan, which are more Islamic affiliated, some extremists, they eventually tried to secede, to separate themselves from the control of Moscow. And due to this intention that were present among some circles, among some representatives of these separatist groups from Chechnya and Dagestan, Russia witnessed a war, an internal war to regain control of those regions. And due to this fact, in the concept of foreign policy of the Russian Federation from 2000, it was mentioned that the fight against international terrorism became the most fundamental task of Russian foreign policy in that time. And also to regain the loyalty of those populations back to the Russian state, and also to weaken their loyalty to religious extremism, in this case, based on Islamic fundamentalism. That's why after the Russian forces, the Russian armed forces, they won the war against the separatists in Chechnya. This war lasted from 1999 to 2009. It was a long war. The Russians had to fight for a long time to regain control of those places. We started to witness some differences, some very important differences between the discourses of Vladimir Putin on the one hand, and the discourses of the West, or some Western leaders on the other, when it comes to the issue of terrorism in general. Because what we can point out about Vladimir Putin is that Vladimir Putin never uses the term, when he speaks about terrorism, he never uses the term Islamic terrorism. He uses the terms extremism or religious extremism, but he never associates, or he never tries to associate terrorism with Islam, which is something that runs contrary to what we have already witnessed from, let's say, the example of Donald Trump, for instance, who made clear associations that terrorism is in fact an issue that is embedded within the Islamic worldview and Islamic thought. So this is something that is quite important to mention, that due to the fact that Russia, that is a sizable Islamic minority that some would estimate runs from 6 to 10% of the Russian population, and just just to mention numbers, it would give a range between 15 to 20 million Muslims living in Russia. So Putin always tries to not alienate them by his political discourse. So he dissociates terrorism from Islam. Well, there is another issue too that is very important to Russia. In 2015, Putin participated in the opening of the biggest mosque in Moscow, the biggest mosque ever done in the country's capital. This mosque, this cathedral, this mosque, it was called the Moscow Cathedral Mosque. And in the discourse there, Putin called the attention of the leaders present to make sure that the followers of Islam, that the Islamic people do not share the same ideas, the same discourse that is made by the terrorists. Putin mentioned that Islam is a religion of peace. He emphasized the peaceful coexistence of Muslims in Russia alongside other confessions of faith like Christianity and also Judaism. And in this event, it was important for Putin to make sure that people did not, the Muslims in this case, did not associate, or that they should discredit the discourse that was made by that time, for instance, by the Islamic State that was present in Syria. So he made sure to make a clear division between what the Islamic State by that time was declaring in terms of building a caliphate, and the Muslims that lived in Russia, that according to the political speech of Vladimir Putin, are peaceful, and also they coexist quite well with the Russian population in general. Nevertheless, apart from the issue regarding the political aspects for the Russian state, I will now enter into the sociological aspects of the Muslim populations that come from Central Asia and migrate to Russia and also become residents, permanent residents in the Russian Federation. Also, the same research institute that I mentioned in the first slide, the Levada Analytical Center, they had a survey of the Russian society, many cities of the Russian Federation, asking what is their attitude towards these Central Asian residents that are mostly Muslims. And then we come to the numbers of 10% of Russians sympathizing with them, 48% of Russians seeing them with neutrality or tolerance, and 38% holding a negative view towards them. Moreover, when it comes to the traits, the specification of traits that they believe these Central Asians have, this survey provided some pre-arranged questions, and in the table that I have in this slide below this picture, we have the answers, the number of answers that were chosen by each 100 respondents. So we see that in the years 2013, 16, and 17, the the most common trait that was pointed by the Russians in regards to the Central Asians was their lack of knowledge or their lack of control of the Russian language. In second place, it was the low level of qualification in the work they do. This was the same option that was chosen in all those 3 years. And in the third place, the Russians mentioned that the third most chosen answer was that they were untidy, and in 2017 they mentioned their high capacity to work even if they receive low salaries. I will enter this subject in the next following my speech. Well, unfortunately, in this case, in the case of migrants, work migrants, first of all, there was some processes. Of course, those were not processes related to states, the state, but it was, let's say, done by the media, a very important part by the media. This show that I mentioned in this slide, I have a picture from a comedic show that is called Nasha Russia. This show was shown in the Russian Open Television from 2006 and 2011. So why did I name this slide, in fact, solidifying stereotypes? Because there was a sketch in this show, very popular show among the youth, especially, that depicted 2 Central Asians from Tajikistan that they live in Russia, and they used to work in construction sites. And then those 2 workers, they always create mess in the construction site. They always do things not in a proper way. They always confuse materials. They never end up doing a good job. And this is a way that this show that was shown in the open television in Russia helped to solidify this view about the Central Asian migrant, which, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, come from Muslim majority countries. So this was also something that is very present in the people's collective knowledge, because it was a very popular show and it used to solidify this view about Central Asians. From a sociological perspective, Huntington, when he wrote The Clash of Civilizations back in the 1990s, he emphasized the existence of dividing lines in Europe based on distinct civilizations. On the one hand, he placed the Western Christendom. On the other hand, he placed the Christian Orthodoxy, which is present in the Eastern European states, and also Muslims. So I would say this division, the sociological division, civilizational division that is mentioned by Samuel Huntington, is not present only in Europe, it is also present in Russia itself. But even though it doesn't bring up some direct confrontational events between those confessions, nevertheless, it brings some ideational clashes or identitarian clashes between those confessions or those traditions. This is a picture of an aerial picture of a Muslim gathering in the holiday Eid al-Adha in St. Petersburg. It gathers lots of Muslims. This is the Blue Mosque, the most popular mosque in St. Petersburg, one of the biggest in Russia and most popular. Those gatherings, they show the religious engagement of Muslims in the Russian Federation, especially in cities, in big cities such as St. Petersburg and Moscow, where their numbers are very significant. And in this particular case, this event, which is has the participation of many Central Asian migrants, I would like to stress the fact that in 2017, the same Institute Levada also extracted an information that 44% of Russians surveyed in 2017 believed that Muslim migrant residents, they increase the likeliness of terrorist attacks in Russia. So this is also a view that is 44% of Russians have about this migrants that come to be very influential on the Russian collective mind. Another thing that I bring into discussion that also is, and now I'm finishing my my presentation, I bring to the concern of all the listeners of this presentation. I have here this graph that I took from the World Bank, and it displays the Russian GDP growth from 2000 to 2020. And we could see that in the beginning, in the first years of the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, Russia had a very significant economic growth due to the rise of commodity prices, mostly oil and natural gas. And after 2014, especially after 2014, when the Western sanctions started to be imposed on the Russian Federation, and the price of the oil barrel also started to fall, Russia saw a decrease in its economic impulse or economic growth. And with that, we can witness that the opinion of the Russians about migration in general also changed following this economic decrease. So if we had, when asked, for instance, what should the Russian government policy be towards migrants, in 2002, the answer regarding the restriction of the influx of migrants was less than half. Russia was growing, the economic situation was better, and this percentage of people who wanted to restrict the influx of migrants, and I must say, again, most of those migrants come from Central Asia. Just in passing, Russia is the destination of 70% of all the Central Asians who live abroad. So this is a very significant number. This number of Russians that favor restriction grew to more than 2/3 when we see the year 2017, and it decreased about 50%. Those who mentioned that the state should not have any administrative barriers to migration. So the economic situation in Russia was getting worse in the recent years if we compare to the first years of the 2000s, and then following this decrease, we see the opinions of Russians in terms of restricting migration also worsening, increasing from less than half to more than 2/3, and it affects how the Russians view their Muslims minorities from those states in Central Asia. I must also finish my presentation, mention that I discussed these issues in more detail in 2 articles that I had published before. If anyone has the curiosity to see it, one of them is in English, Broken Dreams in Ashgabat, an overview of Turkmenistan's post-independence political contradictions and the challenges of Central Asian migrants in Russia. The other one is in Portuguese, Questão do Terrorismo na Federação Russa durante o governo Putin. I would like to also say thank you to everyone, and thank you for the patience to listen to me. I also put there my contact information for anyone who is interested. And to finish it, I would like to dedicate this presentation to Ginaldi Alves da Silva, which is my grandmother who died, unfortunately, this Sunday. Thank you all, and I'm open to questions if we have time. Good presentation, Cassio.
Thank you, Valdir. First, I'm sorry for your mother. It was a very insightful presentation and clearly a very deep research. Now let's move to Cassio Zeng. Please, Professor, have the floor.
Thank you very much, Emílio. And first of all, I would like to send my condolences to Valdir. We are most of all friends in Brics, and therefore we have a sort of solidarity. I would like to thank the organization, especially considering that it was not easy. You have absolutely no idea how difficult, those who are watching have no idea how difficult it was to set up this entire conference. We are always doing voluntary work. As well as in Sepin, we have never received money to do everything that we do with the bottom of our hearts. So, with that being said, it is great to be in such a representative event because we have many students from India who are waking up 3 a.m. to watch. We have Jonas here today, who is probably planning, counting the minutes until he sleeps. And therefore, I will do my best to remain at a reasonable time. So I will share my screen, but I will adapt a little bit because a lot of the topics that I was maybe going to discuss have already been thoroughly discussed by my fellow panelists. So here it is, myself. I would like to point 3 points in my speech today. First of all, introduction, colonialism and neo-colonialism, targeting minorities as probably a tool for colonialism. Brics peculiarities related to vulnerable groups. Of course, I will not discuss Brazilian groups, South African groups, and Russian groups because we have already heard about it. But of course, the problems have been stated already. Concluding, then I will look at diversity as a strong point from Brics. So colonialism and neo-colonialism, starting with some aspects that I have identified in my study within India. The British both fomented a war between religions, and at the same time, they have reduced many different religions, many different practices, many different faiths. They said, okay, everything that it is not European, we are going to call Hinduism. So they reduce sometimes the diversity when they try to colonize India. And this is how we see how a British could look into India. This is a quote from Winston Churchill, who is regarded in the UK as a national hero because he saved the world from fascism. Okay, but he said that a beastly religion, which is deeply, deeply, deeply wrong. And not only that, the Bengal famine of 1943 took place under his, perhaps let's say, guidance. Meanwhile, in China, we would have a different approach, focusing on religious issues during the reign of the Emperor Jiaqing. I don't speak Chinese, I'm so sorry. A law was passed making it forbidden to teach Christianity to some groups, under the penalty of deportation to Xinjiang to Muslim leaders. So the Muslim religion was recognized in the Chinese Empire in the past. But if you tried to teach Christianity, you would be arrested and would be sent to be slave to Muslim leaders in Xinjiang. And at the same time, we see as a colonial tool, this is Macaulay. Macaulay was a legislator, a British legislator who went to India, and he had two main propositions that really threatened minorities and other vulnerable groups. The first one was the educational policy that he took. And the idea was, and this is a quote from him, he wanted to create people that were Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes and opinions, in morals and intellects. He completely obliterated most of what there was of the traditional educational institutions in India. Let us remember, India was the main economic power before the British came into India. They were a huge power economic GDP. They were responsible for 1/3 of the world's GDP before the British arrived. In India, we would see a very strong and peculiar educational system before the British came in. People from all over Central Asia would go and would travel to India to learn. You would have educational institutions in India. The number pi, for instance, the number pi was, people always say, oh, it's Pythagorean, the Pythagorean triangle geometry was developed in Greece. No, Indians had that far before, centuries before. You would have that documented. Laws of war. The Vedantas books, they have law of war. And therefore, we cannot say that, as the British wanted to see and as Macaulay wanted to say, oh, civilization arrived in India. No, civilization was in India well before you British arrived. And you destroyed this through education. And at the same time, another main issue that Macaulay had implemented in India was the criminal code. And the Indian criminal code today is still the same one that was imposed by the British in the 1800s. And it's the Victorian criminal code, which is really harmful to vulnerable groups, including homosexuals. It makes it forbidden because India had adopted that ancient British law, which is a major problem. Perhaps not in the classic minority concept, but in the vulnerable groups, of course, it is a main issue. So targeting minorities, is that a tool of colonialism? As Sanjay Chakravorty says, in fact, regarding the caste system, it had not that much significance before the British arrived, but the British made that into India's social defined statute. So would a caste be a religious group? Would it be a minority in the classical term? It's difficult to state that, but of course it would be a vulnerable group. The caste system would create vulnerable groups. And that would be a direct result from colonial policies as well. So having made my first point, I'd like to point to some peculiarities regarding minorities and vulnerable groups on Brics countries. Of course, as I have said, I will avoid speaking about Brazil, Russia, and South Africa because these countries have already been far discussed here. In India, there is the National Commission of Minorities and 1992 law recognizing Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians and Jains as religious minorities. And the Commission may look into complaints regarding deprivation of rights, safeguards, and minorities and taking that matter to authorities. We also have identified thousands of mother languages grouped in languages in over 100 languages. 22 of them are recognized in the Constitution, which would make a lot already. And there are demands for the inclusion of other 38 languages in India. The Constitution aims for an official use of Hindi, but without interfering with local languages. That may still pose a challenge. We are talking about a country of more than 1 billion people, so we have the diversity, and that should, as Professor Magedi said, it may pose some problems regarding to economic uses of languages. There is a double constitutional protection in Indian Constitution that's very interesting on minority rights, because they have Article 29. Article 29 says any section, of course, shall have the right to conserve the same. So that's the spirit, as my colleague Felipe said, the spirit of solidarity of the group to protect their own language. So the right to non-assimilation, and then also the right to non-discrimination following. No citizen should be denied the access to something. And in, sorry, 2 slides they repeated, my mistake. In China, China constitution says that China is a country with one of the longest histories of the world, and the people of all ethnic groups have jointly created a culture of grandeur and have a glorious revolutionary tradition. So the Constitution of China recognizes the possibility of multi-diversity, and the state will do its utmost to protect the common prosperity of all groups. There is the National People Congress Ethnic Affairs Committee, and it was suspended during the Cultural Revolution, but have now been reopened, and today is chaired by Mr. Bai Chun-li, and former chairpersons included Hui, Zhuang, Tibetan, Miao, and Manchu ethnic groups, and the mission includes the protection of rights of ethnic minorities. This is a very recent photo of National People's Congress President Xi. He meeting Inner Mongolian deputies, expressing the need to demonstrate the Communist Party support for minority rights. So he said that it is important to have cultural self-confidence. Also, there is the recognition of ethnic groups in China. The latest one was the Jinwo group, recognized in 1979. There are over 56 recognized ethnic groups that receive special protection from the state, and there are languages also recognized as regional languages such as Tibetan, Portuguese, English, and Mongolian. So in the photo we have chairperson Xi Jinping and senior leaders watching a gala with ethnic minorities. This photo was September now, very recent photo. And moving to my conclusion, diversity is a bonding aspect of BRICS. I have recently been to a lecture from the Forum for Global Studies, and the main question was, is there a glue that bonds the BRICS countries? Because there is the economic interest, there is the economic agenda, which is very much important, and we, as BRICS researchers, we know very well. But what would be the glue? What would be that makes us together, brings us together? It's not just the economy. In my opinion, diversity and cultural exchanges and protection of minorities may be a bonding tool for us as BRICS countries. So, usually, BRICS countries, while they may have internal provisions related to minority rights, in BRICS documents, it is very rare to find even the expression of minorities. Usually, as here we see the UFA Declaration, agreement to protect culture, cooperation in the field of culture. So, a protection of popular and traditional expressions of culture, traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. So we don't see the rights of minorities, but mostly the right of BRICS states to protect their own culture, which could be used to protect minority groups in that sense of solidarity and the right of these groups to conserve and protect certain cultural features or religious features or linguistic features. The Xianmen Declaration will embrace cultural diversity and promote people-to-people exchange. This was already not a summit declaration, but it was a cultural ministers declaration, following as well as the Johannesburg Declaration recalled the proposition of the BRICS to form a cultural working groups or a BRICS Cultural Council. Fourth, cultural ministers, Curitiba, Paraná, here a about 1 or 2 blocks from where I am now. I have just given my address. Well, they said they view heritage as a cornerstone of cultural cooperation and a commitment to conserve and preserve cultural heritage, archaeological sites, archives, knowledge, expertise, technologies on the field. And then the BRICS meetings that was online, Russia officially, exchange information on preservation. It was museum support, foster cooperation in the fields of musical, theatrical, and other performing arts, horizontal linkages, and allowing young people to have access to cultural heritage and cultural information about the different BRICS countries. And the most recent one, the New Delhi, of course, online, still, damn you, pandemic. I don't know if I should say that, damn you, because it's a curse word. But anyway, they agreed to establish a BRICS alliance between cultural institutions of member countries in the area of conservation and preservation. They agreed to cooperate on the realm of online exchange of cultural experience between member countries in an area and intangible cultural heritage. This is relatively close if we looked at the last year's research that CEPIM did. We looked at IFAM, we looked at Portal IPADES, which are really focused on protection of cultural heritage in Brazil. So maybe this is a path to BRICS. The latest declaration of Indian Minister of Culture, he said he's aware of the ability that culture holds in facilitating people-to-people cooperation in a multilateral world. Concluding, we should not regard minorities as our enemies. This idea that minorities are enemies, this is the result of colonialism. This is the result of many factors, of course, religious factors in some countries. Here in Brazil, we have a certain religious group that are against vulnerable groups. We have issues the same in Russia, in India, in South Africa, we have also in China. But the idea that we should hate each other is something that it is used to divide us. And the glue that may bond us together, not only as countries, as 5 countries, but as 5 countries formed by incredible diversity. This should be a policy for BRICS countries. We have the Belt and Road Initiative from China, and they have the educational Belt and Road Initiative. So why shouldn't we use this initiative to provide integration between people? Here in Brazil, we barely know how many languages there are in other countries, about religion in other countries, about the culture and minorities that each country has. This event was wonderful. And I'm going to spoil people, but one of the most incredible things that we have had in the organization of this conference was to look that most of the people who are watching this conference are not from Brazil. We are reaching a level that more foreigners are watching than Brazilians. This is BRICS integration. How many different religions are represented here? How many languages are represented here? How many effort was put into that? We cannot divide ourselves in only 5 groups: Brazilians, Russians, Indians, South Africans, Chinese. We are talking about 5 states, but we are talking about 5 very, very diverse states, and we should embrace diversity in all of its sides. Thank you very much. Obrigado, spasiba, dhanyavad, Chechnya. And the last one I have just added, I don't know how to speak Zulu. Jabonga. I really don't know how to speak. So thank you very much.
Cassio, thank you for your powerful conclusion. To all of us, you're a reference in the study of the minorities. I believe that in this panel, we've learned that all BRICS countries has a lot to do in terms of minorities, because we are countries with a diversity. It is very strong in our countries, all the diversity of our people, and I believe that we shall learn with each other, and also teach the rest of the world, because I also believe that this is our power uh, in making contra-hegemonic uh, politics. So it's in diversity that we can find the meanings of contra-hegemonic discourses. We have no external questions, and we exceeded the time limit. So I would make one question for you, but in South Africa it's too late now, and of course that we don't want you to get tired. It was brilliant. I appreciate all the panels. I think we have the opportunity here to learn a lot, and we are also thankful to all the audience, as Cassio mentioned, more people from abroad than here, and we are extremely happy for this attention that we are receiving by you. I hope you keep in touch with us, Mr. Jonas. Please, I would like to have more partnerships. It was very insightful, and keep following our schedule. It's very interesting, our conference. I hope to see you all soon. So I will finish now and declare finished our panel. Bye bye and good night.